Hi, I'm Chris Wolfe, co-director of the Thomas International Center, and we're here today to have Class 3 of our short course on the purposes of government and the Declaration of Independence, part of our larger course on American constitutional principles. Now, last class we talked about the first of the self-evident principles of the Declaration, namely that all men are created equal. Saw some of the problems with that, tried to work through some of them. Especially came to the conclusion that where the equality of human beings lies in is especially in they're all having rights. They have a common nature, a common creator, and every person's good is of equal worth. And so in the fundamental respects, people are equal. Now, having said that, let's move on to the second of the self-evident principles, which is that all men are created equal and now endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Okay, now what questions might arise with respect to this self-evident principle, that we're endowed by our Creator with rights? Well, I guess one question that might immediately hit some people today is the invocation of the Creator. You know, don't we have separation of church and state, and doesn't that mean that we don't talk about religion in American politics? Well, of course, that hasn't been the case historically, and it suggests that it's a defective understanding of separation of church and state to say that, you know, religion and politics have simply nothing to do with each other. Obviously, separation in church and state means there has to be an institutional separation. Church and state are different. They're not the same thing. We'll come back and talk about this more later on. But there's that basic separation. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a connection between religion and politics. And this is one of those areas, I think. Separation of church and state certainly means that you're not going to have the same rulers. You're not going to have priests being political rulers or political rulers undertaking any kinds of religious tasks. There's going to be an institutional separation between the two. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we don't know any religion at all, and especially if you talk about what you might call natural theology. There's a theology that is based on revelation, that is, that God has intervened into human history and told us about himself, as that's what Christians and Jews and Muslims believe. But there's also a natural theology as well. That is, that the existence of God can be known. The founders thought, and many of us today think as well, the founders thought that you could actually know that God exists. You should know some of his essential qualities. You can know that there's at least some kind of superintending providence. And so that kind of natural theology, which doesn't depend on a particular religion, but which really is based on the reason to which we all have access, was something that the founders were fairly ready to appeal to because they thought it was quite important. So why would it be important to have this appeal to natural theology and to a creator? Well, precisely with respect to this question of the rights of man. You know, we're all endowed by these rights by our Creator. Now, why is that important? Well, let's step back for a minute and ask, what would be the foundation of rights? Do you believe in rights? I mean, do we all really think that we have rights? Our society clearly is rather strongly based on the ideal of rights. But where do they come from? You know, what if you ask yourself the question, do we really have rights? I think there are two general approaches to the foundations of rights. One is to say that rights are somehow rooted in nature. They're independent of the human will, of human agreements, and they exist irrespective of what human beings do, because they're rooted in nature, and that can be either a natural theology, such as what I've described, or it can be various kinds of ideas about some kind of order that governs the universe, part of which involves these ideas of rights. Now, the alternative approach, I think, let's put that to the side and say we're not going to use the argument of a natural order in order to justify rights. Let's say we don't accept the idea that there is that kind of natural order. What would be the alternative as a foundation for a foundation for rights? Well, I think the best or the most likely alternative is some kind of utilitarian argument. There aren't really kind of rights in any kind of natural order, but here we are, we find ourselves in existence, we find ourselves living on the earth, and we're trying to figure out how to do things as best we can. And somebody might say, life is going to go better if we all treat each other in a certain way. Obviously we could get ahead by doing dirty, nasty things to each other, but that leads to war and it's pretty inconvenient. So let's agree that we're going to have a kind of peaceful society, and we're going to say that we all have certain rights, that A can't do certain things to B and vice versa. And in order to guarantee peace, you have to have these rights. In effect, what you're saying here is that society is coming together to agree to give people rights. So rights are a kind of human artifact, a human invention, in order to make things go better. And some people argue that that's the real foundation for rights, that this widespread agreement among human beings that's really based on a kind of utilitarian argument that will make life go better. Well, what are the problems with that? Why wouldn't the founders have relied on some kind of utilitarian argument of that sort? And I think the answer would go something like this. Utilitarian arguments have a certain kind of weakness, and that is that they're basically asking everybody to agree to recognize each other's rights because things will go better if you do that. But what if you don't convince some people that that's the case? What if some people, in fact, argue that it's foolish to recognize the rights of others? If that's the case, are they going to be constrained sufficiently? This really goes back, I think, to an argument in Plato's Republic. And the first argument comes from a young guy named Thrasymachus, who's kind of a cocky young guy, and he really challenges Socrates and argues that justice isn't something that actually exists in nature. Really what it is this, it's something invented by the weak to try to control the strong. And Thrasymachus thinks he's one of the strong, and so he's not going to be fooled by these silly arguments about justice, especially natural justice. Well, Socrates is able to do a pretty effective job on Thrasymachus because he points out that if Thrasymachus thinks he's so strong, why is it that living in a society, he's going to have to bend to the will of the supposedly weak people who make the law? That is, if the weak people make the law and call that justice, aren't they really the strong ones? Because if Thrasymachus violates the law, they're going to throw him in jail or execute him or exile him or do whatever they need to subordinate him to their law. So even if you regard the law as simply the will of the so-called weak, in a way, aren't the weak stronger than Thrasymachus? So Thrasymachus' argument doesn't get too far. But even when Socrates disposes of him, he moves on to another argument. One of his young friends, Glaucon, makes an argument that isn't that just saying that if you get caught, violating the law, that's going to be a problem. What if you can not get caught? What if you're smart enough to avoid that? He even invents a kind of story called the Ring of Gyges. What if you have this ring that makes you invisible, so you can go around doing unjust things to advance your own good, but because you're invisible, you won't get caught? Isn't that the ideal life? To look like you're just, but in fact, to be unjust. And so Socrates has to kind of come to grips with this argument. And ultimately, the argument that Glaucon makes doesn't really hold water, Socrates argues. But the question is, why? If it were just a utilitarian argument, if it were just a question of getting caught, that would be one thing. But really, Socrates ultimately goes on to argue that really the happier person is not the person who looks just but does injustice to advance his own aims. Really, the ultimately happiest person is the person who is just, who, for a variety of reasons having to do with living according to a certain natural order. So it's just not enough to rely on a utilitarian argument, Socrates would ultimately argue. And I think the founders agreed with that as well, that utilitarian arguments were simply too weak because they were not likely to persuade some people, like Thrasymachus, who think that they're strong enough or smart enough to get away with it. And the result is that that would really weaken society, weaken the respect for rights that we need in order to have a good liberal democracy. So, from the founders' perspective, if you want to have really effective rights, you need them rooted in some kind of natural order and ultimately probably in some kind of religious or theological order, again, a kind of natural theology, where God transcends the universe, and the result is that there's nobody who's going to be smart enough, like as Thrasymachus thinks he is, to escape God's judgment. Ultimately, there's a natural order that transcends human will, and God is the enforcer of that argument, of that order as well. So, for this reason, for these reasons, the founders thought that having a natural theology at the foundation of our rights was essential. That's why they argue that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Okay, so that's the second of the self-evident principles, and with respect to the source. Another question with respect to these principles, however, is what do you mean by inalienable? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Inalienable is a really strong word. It means not only that people can't take away your rights, it means in some ways you can't even alienate them yourself. You can't give away your rights. An example for this, of this is that in American law, if you made a contract to be somebody else's slave, that would not be treated as valid. Let's say there's an economic catastrophe and things really look bad and you want to support your family, and one way to do it, you think, is, okay, I will actually sign a contract making myself somebody else's slave, and he'll give my family a bundle of money to take care of them. And, it's not so great for me, I'm a slave, but at least I've taken care of my family. If you made a contract like that, that would not be honored in an American court. You cannot make a contract to be a slave. Why? Because you can't alienate that fundamental right that you have to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as we'll see in a few minutes when we go on to talk about the content of these rights. So that's a very strong idea. Now, an immediate objection somebody might raise is, but isn't it true that in fact sometimes we don't keep our rights? Think of some examples. One perhaps really obvious example is the death penalty. That was widespread in America. It's still used in some places in America. And basically it says that you can actually take the life of a person who has violated the law in a particularly heinous way. Okay? So aren't we taking away his inalienable right to life? Or what if, much more simply, what if you get fined for, some kind of legal violation? Aren't they taking away your property? What about military service? They can, draft you, put you in the army, make you serve in the military where your life is certainly jeopardized. So isn't that another form of denial of the inalienable right to life and certainly to liberty, because they can send you across the world to a foxhole somewhere else and make you do it. So isn't it true that these rights aren't inalienable? That the founders say they are, but they aren't really? Well, I think the answer the founders would give is something like this. Rights are inalienable, but you have to understand what exactly is the right that's inalienable. It's not a completely unlimited right that's inalienable. So, for example, in the founding era, it was standard terminology to distinguish between liberty and license. Liberty being a legitimate liberty within certain bounds, and license being, doing whatever you feel like doing. Very often today, when we think about freedom or liberty, we think of that, that second meaning, really something more like what the founders thought of as license, just being able to do whatever you want to do, period. And the founders would not have thought of liberty that way because they came out of this intellectual tradition that distinguished between liberty and license. So how do you understand, liberty, these rights, in a more limited way? Well, take something like the Due Process Clause of the Constitution. It says that we have rights that we won't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. But of course, the logical implication of that is that with due process of law, we may be deprived of life, liberty, or property. Now, what would be the grounds for depriving somebody with due process of law of life, liberty, or property? Well, probably the best way to characterize it is to say that you can abridge liberties in the interest of the public good. It's the genuine public good. Now, what do we mean by that? What are some examples of that? Well, the first and most obvious example perhaps is this, that if we have a right to liberty to do what we want to do, what happens when that right bumps up against somebody else's right to do what he or she wants to do? That is, what if our desire to do one thing for our well-being or happiness, or because we want to do it, runs up against the right of somebody else? Rights can conflict. As it's often said, my right to swing my arm stops somewhere short of your jaw. So if that's the case, then it would be, in a way, logically unsustainable to have a society in which everybody literally had the right to do whatever he or she wanted to do, because there'd be conflicts and you'd have to somehow resolve those conflicts. Okay? So that's the first and most obvious case, the direct conflicts of rights. You can move from there to another level, which is perhaps not as obvious or as direct, but is still important. And that's this. Our rights depend on the protection of the law. And so we need this government to protect us under law, as we'll see in a few minutes with some of the other self-evident principles. So if we need a society that will enforce our rights, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what does it take to sustain such a society? I mean, we can't just assume automatically that society will go on without any kind of support. Take two obvious examples of what society requires. One is taxes. Society needs to do certain things. They need some resources to do those things, and they have to get those resources from somewhere, and normally they get it from taxation. That means they're taking your property, but that's legitimate because that is essential for the public good. Sustaining a whole framework in which rights are possible, requires government which has the resources in order to provide the framework. Secondly, think of something like military service. It'll depend on the particular circumstances of a given era, but at some point in every nation's history, there's going to be the need to defend the country. There's going to be wars, legitimate wars, that are necessary in order to sustain the freedom and prosperity of a nation. And if that's the case, the country has to be able to call on its citizens for military service. Well, that obviously involves a significant curtailment of freedom. As your liberty to do something is going to be checked by the fact that instead you have to go off and fight a war. So taxes and military service are two clear examples where society needs to abridge your liberty in order to sustain the society that protects our rights. So now, how far does that go? You could get into gray areas where things aren't so clear, especially with respect to this question of what does it take to sustain a decent society. And this is where we get a lot of questions about, for example, law and morality. Some people would make the argument, I think in some ways almost anybody would make the argument in some ways, that you need to have certain kinds of moral rules in society in order to keep society going. And sometimes those are direct. I mean, you can't kill other people, you can't rob them, rape them, and so forth. But what about more indirect things? What about, for example, people who drink too much and who go out and cause car crashes and kill other people? Or what about people who take drugs and then get into a life of crime to sustain their drug habit? Or what if there is some argument to be made that certain kinds of pornography, for example, may have an impact on how people actually act? A controversial issue, but some people argue that it can serve as a kind of stimulus to antisocial actions of different kinds. Well, this, as I say, this is a gray area. There's a lot of controversy. But if you could show that certain kinds of actions have an effect, and even if only indirect, but a definite indirect effect on the rights and the well-being of others, could those things be regulated by society? In our society, in a liberal democracy, the core, tends to be relatively uncontroversial. You can't, rob other people, you can't murder them, and so forth. As you expand the category to include things that involve more indirect harm to others, that gets more debatable. So the general principle, at least, is that rights can be abridged for the public good. And then we can debate where to draw the line about what actions really do affect others. And so bottom line, yes, we have rights. Those rights are rooted, their source is in a natural order with some kind of superintending providence, a creator. And then those rights have to be understood in a somewhat limited way. That is, they can't be licensed. Your freedom to do absolutely anything you want to do at all, because it's essential that we have some kind of limits to deal with the problem of conflicting rights, and also what you might call the requirements of the public good, or the requirements of the common good. And so that's the second of the self-evident principles of the Declaration of Independence. We're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. In our next class, we'll move on to the third one, which is, among them are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Till then, have a good day.